Hello, everybody, and welcome to Paleo Talks. This is Paleo Talks episode 52 with a slightly smaller crew than usual. I am taking over the hosting duties from our usual Dr. Blaine Schubert, who is in transit right now. He's off traveling somewhere, isn't he?
Yeah, I think he's on his way to Missouri, so maybe he's tuning in. But yeah, not enough cell coverage to tune in from the road.
That's all right. We can handle it. Paleo Talks, as usual, is a production of us here at the Gray Fossil Site and Museum, part of East Tennessee State University Center for Excellence in Paleontology. Every episode, we invite a paleontologist to give a presentation about the work that they're doing, their research, oftentimes recent research, sometimes even recently published, sometimes still in progress. Today, one of the reasons our crew is so small today is because instead of having an outside guest, we are once again going to hear from our own Dr. Chris Widga. How's it going,
Hi.
Chris?
It's going well. Yeah, so it is kind of a small crew today. But at some level we can have a conversation and we can chat about mammoth and mastodon extinctions. This will be fun.
Absolutely. So we are going to hear, like Chris just said, we're going to hear about proboscidean. We really do talk a lot about proboscideans. We have some favorite topics on Paleo Talks. This is only episode 52, and I think we've probably had 4 or 5 episodes about elephants
Only?
one way or another. Yeah,
I think
maybe more.
there's got to be more.
So before we get started, a quick reminder of how it's going to work. Here in just a second, we're going to have Chris start talking about this presentation. And then once he is done, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I might have some questions, but mostly we want to give an opportunity for the people watching to submit questions for Chris to answer. When that time comes, you are welcome to put your questions in the comments of the Facebook video. And as always, I've got the Gray Fossil Site Twitter and Instagram opened. So if you can't leave a comment on Facebook for any reason, you are more than welcome to send us your questions there. My name is David. As you can see on the screen, I am the Science Communications Specialist at the Gray Fossil Site. Chris is our head curator, one of our geoscience paleontology professors. So with this is a very, it's a cozy in-house crew today. So Chris, there is a sort of a tradition on Paleo Talks. Blaine likes to ask our guests how they got into paleontology. And you've already been, you've been on the most of the episodes, you've been our presenter before. So I won't ask you that, but would you like to give us a sense of what you've been doing recently? What's your current project workload look like?
Oh, boy, you put me on the spot.
I did
No,
not give you a warning that I was going
I'm
to
not
push
even going to be talking about that stuff today. No, recently we've been very involved in kind of thinking about the gray fossil site mastodon. As the preparation on that kind of finishes up, we've been scanning it, trying to think about how we get this out on exhibit. Some of the other things, today I'll be talking about the Midwest, and for a long time I've been working on late Pleistocene extinctions, and we have really, in the last couple of months, we've started really branching into other places. And so Derek Anderson, who we mentioned earlier as tuning in from Mississippi State, he and me and Renee Walker, we've been working on some southeastern late Pleistocene kind of big picture. How do these things go extinct? Is it stepped? When do they go extinct? How much do they overlap with people and that sort of thing? It's not a straightforward question. That, and this summer, I've been thinking a lot about grass, actually.
You've been traveling around the mountains looking for grassy spots.
We've got these really unique environments in our high elevation mountains in the Southern Appalachians called grassy balds. They are places that should be treed, should be spruce fir forest, but they end up being dominated by C3 grasses, and they're kind of an ecological mystery. And we've got a team pulled together to do some coring and do some paleoecological work to try and understand how old are they? I got into it because one of the ideas is that mammoths and mastodons were up there during the last glacial maximum and grazed these areas down to nothing, and they've never recovered. So that was one of the one of the recent hypotheses for the origins of these, and the reason I got involved. And so we've been chipping away at it from different angles for a number of years. But this summer, we're trying to find someplace to core. If anybody is out there knows of a sediment record that is within 4.5 kilometers of a grassy bald in the Southern Appalachians, please reach out. I'll put it that way.
It in the online content biz, we call that a call to action.
Yes, so yes, definitely a call to action.
Well, great. Well, hey, you want to get into your presentation and start talking about other proboscideans?
You bet. You bet. So this project is one that's been near and dear to my heart for a number of years. I'm going to share. David and I were experimenting with how to get this to show up. All right. Does it look good?
Yes.
Okay, good. To me. So this is a project that we've kind of had going on for a number of years. Actually, this is the 10-year anniversary of the Midwestern Mammoth and Mastodon Extinction Project. And this started as a project. It actually started before that. It started when I was a curator at the Illinois State Museum in Springfield, Illinois. And there was a number of questions that kept coming up. So fossils would walk in the door. We had a woolly mammoth that was found in central Illinois, and we had this idea that, well, woolly mammoths, ecologically, they should appear, in Illinois at this tiny time slice when glaciers were very close. It was very cold. It was very open. That was how we understood woolly mammoths at the time. This was back in 2005-ish. And then we started dating it. And the dates came back much, much, much younger. And so it turned out that that particular mammoth was kind of shoulder to shoulder with mastodons in spruce ash forests about 12,000 years ago. And that single fossil kind of started a conversation of, well, mammoths and mastodons are not necessarily doing what we were expecting them to do. How would we piece together a better picture of mammoth and mastodon ecology and behavior as they go extinct in the Midwest? And so that kind of born a National Science Foundation project that started in 2011. And basically what it was 4 years of me every summer getting into my truck and driving from museum to museum to museum to museum, inventorying mammoth and mastodon specimens, sampling specimens for radiocarbon dates and other things. This is a really rich, a region that is very, very rich in mammoths and mastodons. You'll kind of see some of that. Right up front, you kind of see that we've used this image before. Blaine and I borrowed it for our Saltville talk a couple of weeks ago, but this is you'll see this again. This is a reconstruction that Velizar Semyonovsky did of a Northern Illinois fossil locality, a mastodon locality called Mastodon Lake. And this actually dates to exactly the right time period for what we want to talk about when we talk about extinction. But kind of to just give you a little bit of an overview to begin with, in North America at the end of the Pleistocene, we have 38 genera that go extinct. This includes mammoths, it includes mastodons, gomphotheres, and a lot of these other megafauna. We kind of define megafauna as animals that are over 100 pounds. And, this extinction really affects them almost exclusively. There are some small animals that go extinct at the same time. And there's certainly a lot of ecological change. There's a lot of climate change. You also have new entries into the continent like humans. This is part of a continental, even a global pattern in extinction. But one of the things that we kind of went into this with was that we really needed to understand the ecological mechanisms of how these animals go extinct. So yes, we could say, oh, it's people. Well, if it's people, you need to find, associations of people and megafauna together. If it's climate, can you articulate a mechanism, an ecological mechanism that climate is impacting that is going to drive these animals extinct? And so this was kind of part of the beginning of this project. And at the time, so this is 2011, 2012, and at the time there was a lot of debate going on. There's still a lot of debate going on. This is one of those things that we seem to argue about over and over and over again. Two of the main scenarios that are out there for why we don't have mammoths and mastodons anymore are, they were either killed off by people, or climate change at the end of the Pleistocene was so drastic that they just went extinct. It helps to kind of boil these things down into actual ecological mechanisms or actual extinction mechanisms. So in the instance of if they were driven extinct by human hunting or driven extinct by humans, you can have human hunting kind of directly driving them extinct, or you can have anthropogenically driven landscape changes like increases in fire, more open landscapes because of disturbance and that sort of thing. And so these are scenarios. These are testable scenarios. With climate change, we've really kind of started exploring some of these ecological mechanisms in more detail. So thinking about things like dietary niches. Do we have niches that are collapsing at the end of the Pleistocene? Do we have niches between different taxa that are overlapping that weren't overlapping before and more increased competition? So there's a lot of nuance in some of these scenarios that is not usually apparent in it's people or climate debate. And at this time, Lisa Nagoka is an anthropologist at North Texas University. She did a very elegant kind of state of the science article a couple of years ago, and was looking at the citation records. And basically she found that within the archaeological literature, basically archaeologists usually kind of cite overkill as one of a combination of causal mechanisms. So they'll say, oh yeah, it could be overkill, it could be climate change, it could be something else, it could be some combination of these things. But she found that actually the further away you get from people that deal with the nitty gritty stones and bones of the paleontological record, they're more likely to accept that people and overkill was hands down kind of a end of argument sort of extinction scenario. So these are some kind of interesting patterns that we see in the literature, but there's actually some data out there. If we were going to treat this as kind of a consensus thing, there have been some surveys and that sort of thing. In North America, which is where I mostly work, there's small surveys, but surveys of Paleo-Indian archaeologists that, they're predominantly kind of citing multi-cause scenarios, maybe leaning towards climate as an extinction cause. The consensus, there is no consensus. Everybody kind of has their own picture of how this is happening and which sites they will accept as good associations, or which dates they like to accept or not. But I think that we can say that there's a lot of nuance in this. It's not a black and white sort of this scenario or that scenario. It's not just humans or climate change. So it was kind of within this context that we started this project. The idea was we would go out, we would date a bunch of stuff, and then we would compare it to other stuff. So we would see when mammoths and mastodons went extinct, because we have a whole bunch of new dates for that. But then we would compare it to new chronologies for when people arrived. We would compare it to new chronologies for how vegetation changed and how climate changed. These things in the last 10, 20 years, we've really refined the chronologies for these other data sets. And so we really needed to compare it to back on the ground, tie it back to mammoths and mastodons, and have a better understanding of when they went extinct. What happened was there were a lot of off-ramps. There was a lot of wiggle in this road. And the more you go out and the more samples you collect and the more nuance you see. And you also are kind of thinking about, how does this fit into other people's research? And so we've contributed to some DNA and taxonomy work. We've contributed to some estimates of human impact in late Pleistocene ecosystems, starting to do some more niche dynamics. And all of this comes back to kind of ecological scale. And we're dealing with it at a regional scale, not at a continental scale. So this is kind of what I'll be talking about today. But to start out with, there's a reason why we chose mammoths and mastodons to really try and address extinctions in late Pleistocene extinctions in North America. And this is about 2011 before we started. And this is, the most complete data set of mammoths and mastodons that we could come up with from the literature. So blue dots are mammoths and red dots are mastodons. You can see that there's a lot of mastodons in the Midwest, but they overlap significantly with blue dots with mammoths. So we were our regional perspective was going to tackle both of these animals, which was a good thing. Overall, we had about 660 localities from North America, which seemed to be a good sample size. You ought to be able to say something with 600 localities. Then we got on the road, and like I said, it was 4 years of basically every summer living in somebody else's collection, and that was fun. I really enjoyed meeting people. I really enjoyed seeing other people's collections. It really opened my eyes to how we do things as a community, and there is no right answer for a lot of these things. We all do what works for us. Everywhere from Lincoln, Nebraska. This is Archie, the imperial mammoth. This is one of our last standing mastodons from central Wisconsin. This is the Kenosha Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where they have a mammoth site where it is associated with some human tools. Royal Ontario Museum, the last standing mammoth in southeastern Michigan, which is mounted at Andrews University. We went everywhere. We went small sites, small museums, and big museums. We went to the Field Museum. We went to the Royal Ontario Museum. These are world-class institutions that work all over the world. We also went to the Boone County Historical Society in Northern Illinois. This was a museum pub crawl. We wanted to capture a good time slice and kind of the entire region. And what we found is that each museum has its territory. Each museum has its catchment area. And so even a world-class museum like the Field Museum or like the Royal Ontario Museum, their geographic catchment area is worldwide. But when we're talking about Illinois or Midwestern mammoths and mastodons, it might be just within a few dozen miles of Chicago. Very rich record up there, but we really needed to kind of go everywhere and do the small museums and the large museums. Ultimately, it was about 50 collections spread across 12 states and 1 province throughout the Midwest. You had some high points. The Indiana State Museum actually had the most mammoth and mastodon localities, over 95 localities, probably pushed out over 100 now. And then our collections at the Illinois State Museum, we had 77 localities. So, some of these state level museums are definitely capturing kind of that geographic sample, which is a good thing. So this is kind of where we were at. This is the data set that we ended up with. So blue is still mammoths, reds are mastodons, black is unidentifiable proboscidean. It was, ivory fragment or bone fragment or something like that. And so you can see we have a lot more sites. And so we basically increased our inventory. So before the project started, within these states, we had about 330 localities. We almost doubled that through the course of this project. So we had over 600 localities just for the Midwestern states alone. And we changed, kind of the big picture too. Before we started, mastodons outnumbered mammoths 2 to 1. And then when we finished, we had about equal amounts of mammoth and mastodon localities on the landscape. So even at kind of this broad scale, we're starting to shift in terms of how we understand these things. But our main thing was to get new dates. We submitted a mountain of dates. Some of those were not good. They were infinite. They were not very well preserved, or for whatever reason did not work out very well. And then we had some that had already been published that are okay, that we added to our data set. In the end, we had 65 mastodons that we were very confident in the age range for those animals. And we had 37 mammoths from the Midwest. We also kind of had last dates, last mastodon, last mammoth standing. The last mastodon standing was from central Wisconsin, western Wisconsin, near a little town called Boaz. This is a mount that is on display. If any of you are near the University of Wisconsin, this is on display in the Geology Museum. And this is one of the latest dates on mastodons in the Midwest. And then the last mammoth is actually the centerpiece of the Andrews University Natural History Museum in Berrien County, Michigan. So if any of you are in that area, stop in and say hello, because these are both of these have actually names. People get close enough, they have a name for them. So this is kind of what we ended up with, and we started playing with data. So before we started, we were able to calculate when the last mastodon was here, and then we were able to calculate kind of a statistical window of when that actual extinction event might have happened. It would have to be after the last dated animal, but depending on how many dates you have in that window approaching that last dated animal, we can either be very concise about and very, very sure of our window. We can tighten up that window, or it can be a really long window. So it's all about statistical probability. And so before we started, we only had 7 dated mammoths. And so our extinction window, our estimated extinction window, was thousands of years long, because we just couldn't, we weren't confident that we were getting the last mammoth. Mastodons, it was a little better, mostly because they were all dating to kind of about the same time period, but it was still about a millennium and a half in terms of our estimate of when they actually would have gone extinct. After we added in all of our new dates, the mastodon window was able to tighten up quite a bit to basically about 300 years. So we now have a very good mastodon extinction estimate. The mammoth window, even with going from 7 samples to 32 samples, it's still pretty broad. And the reason is that we don't have very many mammoths as they go extinct. They're around at the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, and then they slowly get less and less and fewer on the landscape until they finally go extinct sometime after 13,500 years ago. And because they kind of gradually go extinct, we can't be sure that we have the last one. And so that's why you still kind of have a broader extinction window here, just statistically speaking. If we overlay some of these other events that happen, so like the Clovis culture, which is this early archaeological culture in North America that is very distinctive. It's continent-wide, has distinctive tool types, and it's also very constrained in terms of time. Certainly Clovis people overlapped with mammoths and mastodons. We have evidence of Clovis tools in association with mammoths and mastodons in different places. But the actual extinction of mastodons postdates Clovis. So it's not that Clovis was really good at driving them extinct. Mastodons actually survived Clovis. Mammoths, we're not sure. It's still kind of a unknown when they go extinct and whether they go extinct during this time period or not. But the other thing that we have going on is the Younger Dryas climate episode. And this was a cold snap towards the end of the Pleistocene. It was warming and getting more damper in the Midwest. And then the Younger Dryas happened. As it gets colder, regionally, it doesn't seem to get much drier, but it does get colder, and you have kind of a bump in spruce forest and that sort of thing. And our mastodons seem to go extinct at that time. So we'll dive into this in a little bit more detail here. If we look at this in terms of, in a more quantitative way, this is what we call some probability distribution. And basically it's a way to see where most of your dates lie. And so our red line is our mastodon dates, and most of our mastodon dates, we kind of have a peak during the Bowling Allarod, which is this last gasp of the Pleistocene, or it's one of the last gasps of the Pleistocene. It's a time when you see warming and it gets very moist. In the Midwest, we were seeing black ash spruce swamps throughout the Midwest. But we kind of see a peak in mastodon dates at that time. Mammoths are kind of this low level. They're there throughout the last, from about 16,000 years ago to about 13,000 years ago when they go extinct. There's a whole bunch of them. About 20,000 years ago. In fact, during the last glacial maximum, all we have are mammoths. We have no mastodons. So this is kind of interesting. And it was an interesting pattern. And one of the things that we wanted to ask is a follow-up question is, do more dates during this time period actually equal more mastodons? Is this a preservation issue? Is it researcher bias? Because I certainly can't say that I'm above bias. We tried to sample as many different places and different kinds of animals, different contexts as we could, but certainly there's the potential for some bias in there. So if we look at this last period, basically the time period of this peak here, and we look at how they're distributed throughout the region, this is what we see. So red again is mastodons, blue are mammoths. They're overlapping, their range is overlapping. Sometimes they're very close together, and they're probably coeval on the landscape. The red stars here are actually sites where we have multiple animals in the record. So it may be, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the cool things is this is one of the time periods where we have the largest geographic distribution of mammoths and mastodons from the project. We have mastodons throughout the Midwest, and during this time we have them from basically southeastern Nebraska all the way to the East Coast. Some of the follow-up on this has been dating stuff off the coast of New Hampshire and other places that say that basically, yeah, we've got mastodons throughout the eastern US, so they're very geographically distributed. Suggests that they have a large, diverse ecological niches, which is suggesting kind of a larger population. The other thing that we have, which is really interesting, is, like I mentioned, these multi-animal death assemblages. So all the red stars are sites where we have lots of mastodons. The blue star, single blue star, is a place where we have multiple mammoths. Green star is where we have both. I actually can't remember what this is, so that might be something else entirely. These are kind of interesting because all of these multi-animal death sites actually date to the last couple of centuries before these animals go extinct. So we're seeing a lot of mastodons that are on the landscape. We're seeing a lot of mastodons entering the paleontological record at that time. This is including this site that we curated at the Illinois State Museum called Boney Spring in southwestern Missouri. Blaine's on the road today. Blaine's originally from the small town that's very close to Boney Spring, and some of these sites that the Illinois State Museum excavated back in the 70s and 80s. 31 mastodons from the spring site. So it's a very large site in terms of number of mastodons. And so this is one of the main things that I cut my teeth on when I arrived at the Illinois State Museum in 2006, 2007. But what does this look like when we compare it to some of these other chronological data sets that we're working, that people have put together? So if we look at our distribution curve, human colonization, now we keep pushing it back. We now have pretty good evidence that by about 15,000 years ago, there are people in North America, which kind of gives you a fairly long time frame for overlap between humans and Pleistocene megafauna. So, the old idea that people came in, mammoths and mastodons were not expecting these two-legged bipedal predators, the innocence, the naive prey, that scenario is probably not realistic anymore. People were here. They were here for millennia. In this case, mastodons survived Clovis. The things that happened post Clovis, there's not a lot of resolution in terms of what's happening post Clovis in the Midwest, because we have a lot of diversity of different point styles and not a lot of sites where we have datable materials. So the chronology kind of breaks down. But if we look at Clovis, this is some work from a collaborator, Tom Label, back in 2012, basically looking at the distribution of Clovis points in northern Illinois. These are all the same places that we had mammoths and mastodons. They were on the same landscapes. They shared a landscape. And one of the things that was kind of interesting is, even though we almost doubled the number of mammoth and mastodon localities from the Midwest, we started out with 2 possible associations between humans and proboscideans, and we ended the project with 2 possible associations between humans and proboscideans. So if humans are having an impact on local mammoth mastodon populations, it doesn't seem to be widespread. This is a really high resolution record, and we would see things like that. The other thing, we can compare it to some sedimentary records. So some of our viewers may have heard of things like dung fungus, Sporomyella. Sporomayella, which is a fungal spore fungus that lives on megafaunal dung, and it's been used to kind of track megafaunal populations. One of the weird things about our data set is that our peak in mastodons actually post dates some of the Sporomayella peaks that we have in the Midwest. And a lot of this is, we're realizing that there are more things that affect Sporomayella frequencies. But now we're kind of thinking that they're more of a local signal rather than a regional signal, talking to folks that are still working on Sporomayella. But certainly our uptick in mastodon seems to postdate the Sporomayella decline. But we were talking about human influence on a landscape. Our extinction windows also predate the rise in charcoal that would happen theoretically either with climate change or with anthropogenic burning. So in either case, we don't have a fiery landscape at the end of the Pleistocene in the Midwest, which is not surprising because, like I said, it's a spruce and black ash swamp for basically, hundreds of square kilometers. One of the cool things that we do see kind of a parallel here. This is that Mastodon Lake reconstruction that we were talking about. And this is some pollen data from that. Picea is spruce, Fraxinus is ash, and then Quercus is oak trees. And so this is just looking at the frequency of pollen through that core and lining it up with our extinction events. And you can see we've got a lot of spruce. It's cold during the late glacial. Then as things warm up towards the end of the bowling alley rod, we have an increase in ash. And the folks that were doing this pollen analysis thought that this is probably black ash, which really likes swampy wet conditions, cold and wet. You find black ash today in kind of like the northern upper peninsula of Michigan. And this is a disharmonious flora. It's not a vegetation community you see anywhere around today. And it corresponds with our peak in mastodons, which is really interesting. We'll kind of come back to that. That's also this reconstruction here is what this might have looked like. So thanks, shout out to Velazar for doing a fantastic job on Mastodon Lake. That was our goals in this particular project. But there's been a number of off-ramps, a number of kind of discoveries that we didn't expect when we started that kind of came up. And kind of in closing these things out, I'll kind of go through some of these things quickly. One is that when we were looking, we saw very few predators in these collections. Very few large Pleistocene predators like saber-toothed cats or dire wolves, short-faced bears, and that sort of thing. They seem to be very rare. And that's not unexpected for large predators. They're rare on the landscape anyway. But through the project, we were also kind of doing some extra dating of those things to try and understand whether they were still around and kind of when they go extinct within the region. We're also paying attention to things like carnivore modification. If predators are around, if scavengers are around, you should see it on the bone. What we found is that large saber-toothed cats, Smilodon is gone by the interglacial. So, but Homotherium sticks around to about 29,000 years ago. And then dire wolves go extinct about 24,000 years ago. This is 10,000 years, 12,000 years before mammoths and mastodons go extinct. So they're not really sharing that landscape with the last mammoths and mastodons. Short-faced bears are probably still around, but they are very rare and they seem to be limited to more rugged areas. So we're not seeing them in places where we see lots of mammoths and mastodons. The other thing is carnivore modification on these bones is extremely rare. It's more common than human association. So human association is about 0.5% of the entire sample. Carnivore modification is present on about 2.5% of the entire sample. So still extremely rare. And so what this says to us is that we're dealing with some sort of depauperate carnivore guild in the Midwest at this time. We've been thinking about stable isotopes. So call out to Grant Boardman and some of this stuff. We were looking at carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and strontium isotopes in some of these things. The fun thing about isotopes is that depending on what you sample, you can get at different ecological scales. So if you're sampling tusks or sometimes tooth enamel, you can get at things that are, a month average of a diet of an animal. If you're doing bone collagen, it's something that may be years or decades of an average. So if we look at bone collagen through time, here's kind of what we see is time here down on the bottom, 10,000 years over at the right, about 50,000 years over at the left, and carbon isotopes at the top and nitrogen isotopes on the bottom. And red is mastodons again, blue is mammoths. And, they're kind of overlapping for the entire period until you get to this real late part of mastodons. And there seems to be kind of a negative excursion in nitrogen isotopes in our last mastodon standing. They're still, occupying some of these other places, but there's definitely some patterns that are occupying a niche that is not shared with mammoths. And this is something that we've kind of explored in a couple of papers. Still haven't quite put our finger on why that is and what might be characterizing that environment, but it is something that we're getting at a better resolution of. The other thing that we've been working on is getting a better picture from tooth enamel of mammoths. And so we actually have been, the idea is to be able to sample through the thickness of tooth enamel to get at about a month average of an animal's diet, which if we can do that, we can start getting at, life histories, serial life histories of these animals. This has been a fun project. We had to build equipment and design equipment. And this is what we call our first prototype of a micromill, friendly named Frankenstein. It's an old 1950s Olympus microscope, and then we reconverted it with computerized microstages. So we can mount a mammoth molar to this stage and then move it a few microns at a time underneath a drill. This has come up. We have a version 2 now, Frankenstein's daughter. This is in my lab, over here just down the road, and we've got there's been a couple of master's theses, and we've done some other things besides just Midwestern mammoths on this. But this is the kind of data that we get. So here's our carbon isotope. We can get at multiple years of an animal's diet. So we can see how their diet changes through the life of that animal. Not only can we do that, we can calibrate it by season. So here, high points of this blue line are summer, low points are winter. So we can actually calibrate it by season. We can look at how these diets change throughout the year. We can even look at it depending on what time, what the age of the animal was. So in this case, the gray line is an interglacial animal, so it didn't have a whole lot of massive seasonality. It wasn't cold winters and warm summers. It was kind of even most of the year. But the glacial animal we have that is this blue line, we have very, very cold winters. But the other thing that's really cool is we can also do strontium isotopes. And strontium isotopes basically track this animal across a geologic landscape. We are able to do this with not very many animals, but this is what this looks like when we start looking at strontium isotopes in mammoths. We are looking at these mammoths from one of these Missouri spring sites, and it was showing a strontium isotope signature that is very similar to the central core of the Ozarks, about 250 kilometers away. To put that into context, each one of these kind of dotted circles is the maximum home range size for modern elephants. And so we're dealing with 7 modern elephant home ranges away from the place where this animal finally died. So they didn't move very much seasonally, but over the course of many years, they could potentially move, hundreds of kilometers. So this is kind of fun being able to map these things on. So we're getting at a number of new facts, new statements that we can make about some of these populations. And that gets us back to the idea factory. The Midwest is I will say it's been a fun place to work because the mastodons and mammoths are everywhere. So there's a lot of questions out there, and there's a lot of people that have been trying to wrap their brains around them. Our suggestion, given that we had so many mastodons, and we have these mastodon multiple animals that are dead and in a single site. This is something that could be explained by an unstable population that is controlled by ground up controls rather than top down controls. We have no predators to remove too many mastodons. So we have a lot of, maybe that diet and the availability of forage is driving mastodon population. So we may be doing something like this towards the end of the Pleistocene, where these multi-animal death assemblages are actually the peaks, or maybe the troughs, maybe they're just off the peaks. This is a classic carrying capacity curve that you see in ecology. And this is something that fits with a number of our facts that we've kind of come up with. The other thing, one of the other ideas that's out there is one that Dan Fisher has come up with, that as you have these animals that are being, he thinks that there's more of them that are being hunted, and that hunting pressure decreases the age and maturity of these populations. And so you have basically mastodons that are maturing more quickly. This is something that has isotopic implications. So we could actually see an increase in nitrogen isotopes in some of these earlier molars if this is occurring. Unfortunately, we didn't have very much data on this, so this was not something that we were trying to tackle at that point in the project. But it's something that we could chase down in the future, probably. The other thing is there's the idea that if people are hunting these animals, they're pushing them into non-optimal niches. And so you're going from basically this uniform distribution of mammoths and mastodons on a landscape to a more concentrated distribution. This also would have some isotopic implications, but we really haven't chased those things down yet. So we've also thought a little, I know usually I'm the guy going, hey, we should wrap this up. But today I'm the one that is not doing that.
I'll step in while you get to the end here and remind everybody that if you have questions, start putting them in the Facebook comments or find us on Twitter and Instagram so we can build up some questions while Chris wraps up this last section.
Yeah. So the other thing is there's been a lot of bycatch here, and a lot of really good DNA studies that have been coming out of using specimens that we've collected and others have collected and trying to understand taxonomic relationships. Stephen Zhang is probably on here somewhere, and he just was a part of a big paper that just came out looking at proboscidea extinctions and speciation events over the long term. And taxonomy is important, understanding biodiversity, and whether you have 5 species or whether you just have one is kind of important when you're talking about extinctions. So these are some of the other things that have come out. And then finally, we're really getting into things like niche modeling and understanding kind of at the really local scale what is happening with the local vegetation, with the local ecosystem as these animals are going extinct. And so this is Yui Wang, shout out to her. She took some of our data and dumped it into an ecological model to understand that as mammoths are going extinct in the Midwest, they actually cannot follow the glaciers to the north. There's actually an ecological barrier in terms of vegetation communities that they don't like to traverse, that would have prevented them from moving north and kind of hanging on for a little bit longer. Part of this is also, this is a screenshot of one of our recent master's theses by Matt Harrington, looking at the Hot Springs Mammoth site. So shout out to you guys too. Looking at mobility in the Hot Springs mammoths through the life of a single mammoth. And so the Hot Springs Mammoth site is down here, and the strontium isotopes on that particular mammoth could have come from any of these areas, but they seem to be avoiding some of the high slopey areas from the interior of the Black Hills, which is kind of interesting. But then finally, the direction that this is going is we're really moving geographically outside of the Midwest. So now I'm down here at Gray. So we're working on the Southeast, and kind of fine tuning some of these chronologies down here. We've moved to the east. This is a mastodon and a mammoth that came off the coast of New Hampshire a couple of years ago. We've done a little bit of work on pygmy mammoths out in the Channel Islands of California. So, scaling up geographically from the Midwest is kind of some of the next steps in this and where we're going with it. So we kind of revisit this whole, what caused the terminal Pleistocene extinctions? Was it humans? Was it climate? Was it something like hyper disease or something else? And ultimately we're still kind of here. I will not point my finger at any one of these things, but I do think it's important as we move forward to try and characterize these populations, the health of these populations as they go extinct, and kind of understand those things. I suspect we're getting closer. It's going to change. That answer is going to change depending on where and when you are. So that is the end. But, there's a lot of collaborators involved in this, a lot of institutional collaborators. And through the years, we've worked with just so many people. And thank you to everybody. Thank you to the curators and collections managers that put up with me for 5 years in their collections. So with that, yeah, let's answer some questions.
Thanks a lot, Chris. You know, well, so like I said, people go ahead, send in your questions. We've got a couple that have started coming in. A couple of thoughts that I had while looking at this, I think that what this project really drives home for me is the importance of having just a big pile of data.
Yeah.
You know, there's been a lot of discussion about extinction on the internet in the last couple of days. Mostly I've seen it around the Cretaceous extinction because a new paper just came out that is relevant to that. And there's a lot of talk about the uncertainties involved in trying to nail down exactly when extinctions happen, exactly what an extinction looks like or a decline in populations look like, and when it's out of the ordinary or when it is a normal thing to expect. And what's really striking about this project is that you were able to just get a whole bunch of data to really fill in a lot of that picture.
That was the point. Yeah, I mean, and that's where we were kind of in the beginnings of this project, and kind of the impetus for this project was you had all these ideas that were flying around out there that were plausible scenarios, but you had no data to throw at it, or very little data to throw at it. And so, you know, that was our argument, is just let us go out there and collect data that is, it has implications for testing some of these different scenarios. And you know, the mammoth and mastodon record for the Midwest it's phenomenal. You know, when we talk about these things, we joke about it. You know, at the bottom of every farmer's pond in northern Indiana or northern Illinois is some sort of mastodon offering. They are everywhere, and you know, when they are found, they are often noted, and they are donated to a local museum. And so that really became kind of one of the driving forces with this is an unparalleled record that all we need to do is put in the miles and put in the radiocarbon dollars to really say something.
Well, and that was another thought I had while looking at your description of collecting all this information. Is it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, that this is a project that is uniquely suited to the animals that you're studying.
Yes.
You know, like mammoths and mastodons, not only are they abundant and not only are they big and easy to notice, but they have a very long collection history.
Yeah.
Here in North America, especially. So it seems to me that if it weren't for the popularity of people having, you know, excavated these for hundreds of years, you wouldn't have this data.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a preservation bias. There's also a research bias and a collecting bias that's inherent in this, which is kind of why we limited it to mammoths and mastodons. That said, mammoths and mastodons figure prominently in almost every extinction scenario. You know, if you look at the association between humans and megafauna, it is there are 15 kind of universally, well, maybe not universally, but most people will agree that there are 15 sites in North America where you have human tools in association with Pleistocene megafauna. Of those 15 sites, 14 are mammoths and 1 is mastodons. The one mastodon site was the Kimmswick site. It's just south of St. Louis, and it was part of our collection, part of our sample here. And one of the fun things was going back and looking at Kimmswick. This is, you know, revisiting some of these sites that were excavated, you know, 50 years ago, or in the case of Kimmswick, it was excavated multiple times over the last 120 years, and getting a better understanding of really what is the association between those tools and the mastodon bones was really fun. Kimmswick is fun because it's got a history of like dozens of mastodons coming out of a hole, and humans were not part of that equation until the late 70s, when, you know, paleontologists discovered Clovis points in association with mastodon bones. It's probably more complex than just a Clovis group killing a bunch of mastodons, looking at the history of excavations and the kinds of things that come out of there. But that's another project and another talk for another day.
Well, speaking of all those collections of mammoths and mastodons, we got a question here from our friend Jeannie, who says, you spoke about getting into your truck and visiting collections in person. Is there something that you wish museums could do to make collections more accessible to more people? In other words, could museums move to digitization, and would that improve research?
And thank you, Jeannie. Hi, good to see you. If anybody wants to follow anything Proboscideans, Jeannie is the curator of Mostly Mammoths, a blog project. So she keeps on top of things. Yes. And actually, we've kind of moved in that direction. I spent 2 hours talking to a representative from Artec Scanners this morning in Luxembourg, and he asked me the same question. Has 3D scanning and digitization changed the game in terms of how you learn about Proboscideans? And I would argue it has. I mean, at least in my career. In the bread and butter of paleontologists is morphology. Sure, we've got fancy, radiocarbon dates and DNA and that sort of thing that we can rely on now. But ultimately, what I think about on a daily basis is shape and size. And Proboscideans are tough to do, because every museum has one, or they have two, or they have six, but no museum has, 3 dozen from all over the world, showing the complete amount of morphological variability that is present within a species. And so for the last 10 years, whenever I've gone to a museum, I've 3D scanned things. Many museums are getting on board with 3D scanning their own collections. There's been researchers, shout out to Bernard Means, who's been doing his own museum crawls through North American museums and scanning mastodons and mammoths. And so now I think that there's a really good, there's kind of a critical mass of material that is out there publicly available to say things about morphological variability. A lot of these things also have associated radiocarbon dates. Some of them have associated DNA. So you can ask much more specific and much more precise questions in sophisticated ways with digitized specimens, and especially 3D scanning. Some things would never happen without having 3D scans, I think. Some conversations that I've had would have never happened without 3D scans.
And the impact of that digitization process, we see at Gray. Not only are we doing our own digitization, Chris, before we started, I think you were looking at that tusk behind you, which is a 3D print of the Gray fossil site mastodon. But I'll walk into the prep lab and Sean has 3D prints of mastodons.
Oh,
the other day he had he's putting together the face of the Gray fossil site mastodon, and he's got a bunch of different skulls. Sean the other day had a little printout of Max, our Pacific mastodon friend, sitting right next to our mastodon as he's using those as a guide to understand mastodon morphology.
It's hugely helpful. This box has been following me around whenever I move my office during the pandemic. It's all 3D prints of mastodon teeth, and these are from all over the world. They are early Myoplacine mastodons from Oregon and California. They're from the Western Science Center. There's some from Europe. There's some from the Eastern US and some of our work here. And, there were days during the darkest days of the pandemic, I just laid these out and I'm like, okay, physical specimens are still important, but in order for us to really get all these things together in one place, this would never happen without 3D scanning and printing, or it might happen, but it would be an effort that takes years rather than an effort that takes a couple of months. So this is definitely a really good bycatch from some of the new technology.
Yeah. Now, speaking of mastodon specimens, we got a question from Sam, who asks, of the collections you visited, which was your favorite or had the most specimens you were able to use for study?
Oh, geez. It's hard to pick and choose. It's like choosing a favorite child. Depending on the day, I do have a favorite child, but uh, and depending on the day, I probably have a favorite museum. There, every museum has a strength, and so you know, I really enjoyed places like Big Bone Lick in Kentucky for its historical value, and Cincinnati Museum has some material from there. I enjoyed the Field Museum because they were capturing just these beautifully preserved bog mastodons from the 1920s when they were starting to drain some of the agricultural areas in northern Indiana and northern Illinois, and they're just beautifully preserved. But then also someplace like the University of Nebraska, where I'm from Nebraska. I got my undergraduate degree at the University of Nebraska, and I've spent, oh gosh, I person months, person years in that museum looking at and thinking about elephants. Even though I started out with bison, I've spent a lot of time looking at their collections. And every time I go back there, I find new things and that I'm like, oh, mind blown, time to, rethink what I was working on before. So, there are some really neat collections out there, especially for those of us that do, um, work with groups that are kind of more ubiquitous.
When you were traveling around, were there any rock star specimens that you were really excited to get to meet? Did you have any, a fan moment?
I had a list of rock star specimens I wanted to meet, because I mean that's one of the fun things about the Midwest and mammoths and mastodons is like I said, everybody has one, and often it's that one that is really nicely complete and it's mounted in their museum. And I spend like 2 days kind of climbing all over ladders and measuring things and that sort of thing. One that comes to mind as certainly unique, and one that I visited multiple times. It has a name, like many of our favorite fossils. They have names. This one's Perry. And Perry is on display at Wheaton College in Chicago area. Perry is a unique mount. Half of Perry is mounted as a skeleton, and half of Perry is mounted as a resin uh, reconstruction of the soft tissue. Perry used to be also mounted on a large rotating platform that you would press a button and there would be a voice that would come out and give you basically a canned tour in the round of Perry. So yeah, I really enjoyed Perry. I visited Perry multiple times.
That's very cool. It makes me very hopeful. One of the reasons I think that we end up talking so much about proboscideans in our paleo talks, not only do we have a resident proboscidean expert in you, Chris, but we are at the Gray Fossil Site very excited about proboscideans because, the last 5 years or so that has become a central focus at the Gray Fossil Site. And we have spent the last couple of years talking about the future of our mastodon. Not only in terms of research, right? What is it? We're looking forward to getting some publications out on it. I say, lumping a little bit of extra pressure on Chris to get that
We'll get there.
moving. But also the future, it's currently in the process. If you follow the Gray Fossil Site social media, you've seen that our mastodon is moving out of the prep lab. Finally, right? All the big pieces that have been in there for years are moving into collections. And we've been in talks about updating our exhibits and getting replica of our mastodon on display. And I often think about it in the very short term, right? Where is it going to go in collections? What's it going to look like on the exhibit floor? But thinking about it in the long term, it's exciting to think that we have a specimen that could be part of someone's road trip in the future, or to get back to Jeannie's point, part of somebody's online search for digitized materials, looking to learn about mastodons.
Yeah, and I think the using the example of Gray, one of the fun things about proboscideans, and part of the reason why we've had such good conversations, I think, too, when we've had folks talking about proboscideans on the show, it's really difficult to do them alone. You know, it, you can't lift them.
I
You
was going to say
can't,
you can't even
you know,
move them alone.
yeah. So everything is a team effort. And that includes, the excavation, analysis, prep, curation of the Great Fossil Site Mastodon. It has been a team effort from the beginning, where everybody has been involved. This is, and so you see it on social media. This is not something that you can kind of say, oh, we're not going to let this out into the world until it's done. It's something that everybody is involved in. I would say that, the public and those people that are out in the world are also kind of commenting and interested, and they're involved. They've seen it happen. This is not something that happens overnight. It's not something that's easy. And so it's something that the story is coming together before your very eyes.
Yeah. So if anyone out there, if you aren't following our social media, check it out. We've got updates on our Mastodon projects. We post when we've got cool new research that our crew is doing recently and upcoming. There are going to be some more photos of a rhino foot that we just pulled out of the Mastodon pit.
Yeah, that's cool.
Which is a fun feature of the site now, that even though the big mastodon skeleton, the excavation is essentially done for that skeleton, it's still at work in the lab. There's now a mastodon-sized hole in the fossil site that continues to produce cool stuff. This rhino foot just came out of there. An alligator humerus just came out of there the other day. So it's
well, we keep finding more mastodons too.
And we keep finding,
so,
one does not simply dig up a mastodon.
No,
There's just a whole lot that comes with it.
We're going to need to build a new museum
just for the mastodons.
Just for the mastodons. Ooh, yeah. Thinking about visitors in the future. Yeah.
True. There we go. We'll need to make our own version of they've got that Backyard Terrors place with all the dinosaur statues and stuff. We'll have to do that here with mastodons.
Oh, that'd be cool. I'd like that. Yeah.
I'd do it. We'll offer rides and stuff. It'll be
move my office out there. Yeah.
Chris, this has been a great presentation and a really good conversation. You've gotten a lot. We didn't get a ton of questions, but we did get a ton of compliments. People say thank you, and they say great talk, and they say very cool talk, and they say excellent talk. This has been a big hit among our Proboscidean interested friends.
Good.
Here on the internet.
There's a few of them. Yeah.
Yeah. People like elephants, and I can't blame them.
No, this is good. I'm glad that people were able to tune in. Like I said, this is something that I've been thinking about for quite a while. But a lot of times when we talk about it, we get distracted. We talk about gray, or we talk about, predators or something else, or grass. And I never get around to actually talking about some of the cool things that we did do. But yeah, so yeah, for those of you that are out there that are involved in this, thank you. I probably there's an Emil Karpinski, and there's some others that have been on the show that have been involved in different ways. But yeah, this is fun science. I really enjoy it.
Well, on the note of fun science, there will be more Paleo Talks to come in the future. We are now operating, we used to be on an every week schedule, barring occasional skipping of weeks. Now we are on an every 2-week schedule, barring occasional skippings of weeks. Chris and I are both about to go on vacations, so keep your eyes out for when the next episode will be up. It'll be sometime in the coming weeks as we get accustomed to this new schedule. And hopefully next time when we get back, we'll be a full crew again. We'll have Blaine back with us. We've got a handful of exciting guests, some returning, some new, lined up for upcoming episodes. So as always, thanks to everybody for joining us. Thanks for watching. Thank you for all of your comments and compliments and questions. Audience engagement is a really fun part of this program, this Paleo Talks that we do. Once again, we are coming to you from the Gray Fossil Site and Museum, part of the East Tennessee State University Center of Excellence in Paleontology, and it has been our pleasure to talk to you about cool mastodon and mammoth stuff. Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks a lot to everybody, and I think we're going to sign off now.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Bye, everyone.